A black teen stands in a courtroom and is humiliated for mispronouncing a word until she stuns the judges by flawlessly reciting the entire U.S. Constitution backwards. What started as a moment of public shame ignites a national reckoning on race, justice, and who gets to speak in America. From viral fame to political retaliation, her voice becomes a weapon and a movement. She didn't just memorize history, she rewrote it. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It was a rainy Thursday in Baltimore, the kind that paints everything gray and presses a wet hush onto the streets. Inside the city's municipal justice hall, a different kind of silence awaited. A charged, expectant silence, broken only by the occasional squeak of polished shoes against marble floors. Seated in the chamber, among rows of rigid chairs, was a girl too brilliant to be ignored, yet too often dismissed. Taria Monroe, 16, born with a mind like steel and a heart shaped by hardship. Taria sat in her charcoal blazer, her fingers intertwined tightly on her lap. Her braids were pinned back neatly, her glasses slightly fogged from the drizzle outside. She had not come here to defend herself against the law, she had come to compete. It was the state's Youth Constitutional Oratory Finals, a once-a-year platform where the brightest students from across Maryland recited and interpreted the U.S. Constitution before a panel of state-appointed judges. But for Taria, it was more than a competition. It was a reckoning. Raised in the shadow of injustice, Taria's brilliance had always been her survival tool. Her grandfather, Walter Monroe, had been jailed at 19 for loitering with intent, a charge the family still couldn't make sense of. He lost 5 years of his life behind bars, during which his right to vote and pursue college disappeared like smoke. Her mother, Dana, had once been suspended for confronting a teacher who read aloud a racially charged passage without context. In the Monroe household, racism was not an abstract idea, it was family history. As Taria stood to make her way to the lectern, eyes trailed her. Some curious, some skeptical, a few overtly dismissive. She could feel it all, the gaze that always said, "You don't belong here." But she walked with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to endure it. The panel of judges, 5 men and 1 woman, all middle-aged, white and polished in their robes, adjusted their spectacles and looked over their score sheets. At the center of the bench was Judge Raymond Bennett, presiding head of the committee. The air was cool and crisp. The American flag behind the judges didn't move, but it loomed, watching. Taria began confidently. She opened with a powerful quote from the preamble, interpreting it not as an ideal achieved but as a promise deferred. Her analysis of Article 1 was clear and precise, pointing out the structural imbalances baked into legislative representation during the nation's founding. Her voice, calm but rich with conviction, carried through the courtroom like a river running under ice. Then came the final round, the live clause challenge. Each finalist was given a constitutional clause to interpret on the spot. Taria was handed a slip of paper. Her clause, "No bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed." She looked down and took a breath. A flicker of doubt passed across her face. Not because she didn't understand the clause, but because of a word she had never been asked to say aloud before. Attainder. She'd read it dozens of times, but had never pronounced it in speech. Still, she pressed on. "The Constitution forbids any bill of attainder," she said, carefully, emphasizing what she thought was the correct pronunciation. A pause, and then it happened. Judge Bennett leaned back slowly in his chair, removed his glasses, and laughed. Loud. "That's not how you say it, sweetheart," he said, grinning sideways to the other judges. The room didn't laugh with him, but it didn't stop him either. Taria's lips parted slightly, the breath in her throat frozen. She hadn't prepared for this. Not the clause, not the mistake, but the public unraveling of dignity in a room that was supposed to honor intellect. She looked around, but no one spoke. Not the moderator, not the other students, not the lone black custodian in the corner, who simply bowed his head. This wasn't a correction, it was a dismissal. And behind the silence, a current surged. What Judge Bennett hadn't seen, what no one had prepared for, was that Taria didn't flinch because she was embarrassed. She flinched because she remembered something. Something her grandfather told her, sitting on their cracked porch under the Baltimore sun. "If they don't want you to speak, speak louder. If they mock you, make them remember your voice long after you've gone." So she stood there, frozen for only seconds, and then looked Bennett dead in the eyes. Her voice didn't tremble. "Would you like me to recite the entire Constitution backwards?" she asked, evenly. There was a beat of silence. Someone laughed under their breath until she began. Amendment 27, no law, varying the compensation for the services of the senators and representatives. The courtroom stiffened. She wasn't bluffing. Word by word, line by line, clause by clause, Taraya began to deconstruct the most sacred document in America's legal framework in reverse, syllables sliding off her tongue like piano keys struck in backward melody. The judges didn't know where to look. The room was no longer hers to be judged in. It had become her stage, her syllabus, her battlefield. And at the back of the chamber, the custodian slowly looked up. Because racism in institutions doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a robe. But no one expected what Taraya would say next. As Taria's voice echoed through the chamber, reciting Amendment 27 backward with surgical clarity, the courtroom no longer felt like a place of judgment. It felt like a reckoning. The judges shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether they were witnessing a student's defiance or something far more profound. But for Taria Monroe, the words weren't just memorized, they were inherited. Her brilliance had not been birthed in a vacuum. It was carved out of survival. Decades before her defiant act, in a different America that somehow felt disturbingly similar, her great-grandfather Walter Monroe had walked into a convenience store in southern Maryland after his evening shift at the docks. He was 20 years old, newly married, and wore a name stitched into his work shirt. He had been saving to go to trade school, dreaming of a future without calluses. But that night, a white woman accused him of acting suspicious. He had been holding a pack of gum and counting change. A police cruiser appeared before he could step outside. Walter was arrested for intent to commit theft, a charge not supported by any evidence. He was held without bail for 10 months before even seeing a courtroom. When his case was finally dismissed due to lack of proof, the damage had already been done. He had lost his job, his home, and his dignity. No apology, no expungement, just a mark that followed him on every application form for the next 40 years. Taria had never met him. He died before she was born, but she felt him. She had read his prison letters, smudged with desperate ink and folded neatly in her mother's memory box. She had seen his face in an old Polaroid, eyes tired, but still holding a quiet fire. Her mother, Dana Monroe, used to say, "Your great-granddad didn't stop breathing in prison. He just stopped dreaming." And it wasn't just Walter. Dana herself had been a fighter. When Taria was 9, her elementary school celebrated American Heroes Day. The curriculum featured presidents, war generals, and inventors, but not a single black name was mentioned. Dana, then a social studies teacher, had gently questioned the oversight. She asked the administration if her students could learn about Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and James Baldwin, instead of coloring the American flag all week. 2 weeks later, Dana was placed on unpaid leave for inflammatory conduct. She never returned to the classroom. Instead, she became a night librarian and took care of Taria with a tenacity only the wounded carry. She used books as her rebellion and bedtime stories as ammunition. Taria grew up not just learning about America, but seeing its contradictions unfold at her dinner table. The Constitution was not a sacred text to her family, it was a battlefield, and she had learned to fight with words instead of weapons. As she stood in the courtroom now, unflinching, her voice slicing through Article 5, the connection between past and present was undeniable. Every syllable she spoke was a form of protest. Every clause was a ledger of unpaid debts. The judges didn't know it, but they weren't watching a recitation. They were watching a resurrection. Because this wasn't about a spelling mistake. It was about the centuries of exclusion hidden behind the facade of merit. It was about the subtle smiles of disbelief when black excellence emerged in white spaces. It was about Taria being asked, just a month before, "Did someone help you with your application?" when she submitted her oratory proposal. It was about how even brilliance, when wrapped in black skin, is treated with suspicion. And now, in this sacred chamber of law, Taria was returning every unspoken insult with a line of the Constitution in reverse. Dana watched from the audience, her hands clenched tightly on her lap. She knew this wasn't just her daughter speaking, it was every silenced voice in their bloodline echoing through her. What if centuries of pain could be turned into one defining act? What if shame could be remixed into mastery? A hushed murmur began to ripple through the courtroom. The stenographer had stopped typing. A security officer leaned in to listen. Even Judge Bennett, whose smirk had long vanished, now stared at Taria like she had grown wings. She moved to the final portion of the Constitution, the preamble. Backwards, word by word. Liberty established to order and tranquility. Domestic ensure to union perfect. A form more OY, in States United the proficats. Of we, silence. No applause, no movement, just reverence. And in that stillness, something unspoken broke open. Not every story about racism ends in fire and chaos. Some end in unbearable stillness, when those in power realize they've underestimated the wrong person. Taria exhaled. She wasn't trembling. Her shoulders relaxed, her voice steady, But deep inside, something had shifted. She hadn't just defended herself. She had redrawn the lines of what it meant to be black and brilliant in America. She didn't just memorize, she mastered. But what she said next would break the internet and the system. The silence in the courtroom still lingered like smoke after a quiet explosion. Taria stood steady, not victorious, not defiant, but complete. Yet as she lowered her eyes from the judge's bench, the journey that brought her to this moment flashed like lightning through her mind. Because brilliance doesn't always rise in well-lit rooms. Sometimes it grows in shadows, unnoticed, misunderstood, and underestimated. Taria Monroe had always been a quiet child. While other kids rode their bikes or played tag on cracked sidewalks, she sat on the back porch of her family's apartment complex, with a pencil wedged between her teeth and a battered copy of the Federalist Papers in her lap. It wasn't that she didn't want to play, she just knew the world expected her to run fast, jump high, and stay quiet. She chose to do the opposite, sit still, read deep, and speak only when the weight of her words could tip a room. Her obsession with the Constitution began at 10, not in a classroom, but at home, when her mother placed an old legal textbook in her hands, a gift from a neighbor who once dreamed of law school before a felony conviction ruined everything. "This book is yours now," Dana said, pressing the heavy volume into her daughter's hands. "Learn it. One day you'll need to remind them what they wrote." Taria did more than read it. She consumed it. Every clause, every amendment, every contradiction etched itself into her mind. She didn't just memorize. She dissected, questioned, rewrote. She made flashcards not for definitions, but for hypocrisies. She circled phrases like equal protection and scrawled in the margins. "Then why not us?" Her brilliance, however, didn't gleam the way teachers expected. She didn't raise her hand often. She didn't chatter in class. She didn't come from a household that could afford enrichment programs or private tutors. She wore thrifted sweaters and brought lunch in reused plastic containers. And in an education system that often confuses silence for simplicity, Taria was labeled average. At Roosevelt High, her 9th grade history teacher once mistook her for a substitute student. "You're in the wrong room, hon," he said on the first day. She corrected him with a flawless recitation of the Marbury v. Madison ruling. He chuckled nervously but never looked her in the eye again. She turned in essays written with surgical clarity, laced with historic nuance most college students failed to grasp. They came back marked with comments like, "Nice effort," or "Did you have help with this?" Her SAT prep tutor once told her, "Don't worry too much about the reading section. Focus on getting your math score up. That'll open more doors." They didn't see it, the rebellion brewing beneath her composure. Because while the world tried to shove her into boxes marked quiet, black, girl from the projects, Taria was secretly developing a mental arsenal. She had something not even her most well-intentioned teachers could understand: reverse comprehension. A rare skill. She could not only remember everything she read, she could mentally deconstruct and reconstruct it, sentence by sentence in reverse. Her brain worked like a movie reel played backward, stitching together logic from the end to the beginning. One night, while waiting for her mother to return from the night shift, she tested herself. She opened the Constitution and began reciting it aloud from the final amendment back to the preamble. It took her 2.5 hours. No errors, no pauses. That night she wrote in her journal, "They will laugh. Let them. My memory is my mother's revenge." By sophomore year, Taria had grown into a kind of quiet legend, not among teachers, but among the students who knew what it meant to be invisible. Kids like Luis, who had been wrongly accused of plagiarism because his grammar was too clean. Or Nia, suspended for attitude after asking why her history textbook only had 1 page on slavery. They watched Taria closely, not because she was loud, but because when she spoke, the room cracked open. Still, most adults in her life missed it. They saw a girl who rarely smiled, who never joined clubs, who read court transcripts during lunch, and sketched amendment timelines on the back of her notebooks. A few called her intense. Others said she was socially behind. None recognized the storm building behind her eyes. Because Taria wasn't just a student, she was an intellectual insurgent. Her notebooks weren't filled with doodles or class notes. They were filled with legal analyses, annotated contradictions in civil law, and rewritten amendments the way they should have been written. In her margins, she often scribbled phrases like "law is not justice," or "who gets to write history decides who lives through it." The more she learned, the angrier she became. But not the kind of anger that boils over. Hers fermented, aged, became sharp and precise. And then came the day the school announced the state constitutional oratory competition. At first, Taria hesitated. Not because she doubted her ability, but because she knew what it would cost her to be seen. Visibility wasn't just a spotlight, it was a crosshair. But that night, she found a crumpled photo of her great-grandfather in her mother's desk drawer. His eyes, tired but unbroken, stared into her future. She knew what she had to do. The application asked for a short essay. Taria submitted a 20-page proposal titled, "The Constitution, a Masterpiece of Exclusion." She knew it would raise eyebrows. She hoped it would raise consciousness. 3 weeks later, she was selected. And now, standing in front of Judge Bennett and the silent crowd, the words she was about to speak would no longer be about scoring points. They would be about igniting history. She wasn't here to win. She was here to declare war. And her first target was sitting right in front of her. As Taria stood at the center of the courtroom, her voice a weapon sharpened by years of erasure, Judge Raymond Bennett sat still, frozen beneath the weight of his own unraveling mask. His smirk had vanished, replaced by an unreadable expression that flickered between disbelief and discomfort. For the first time in his long curated career, the control he'd cultivated through charm and power was slipping, and everyone could feel it. To most who met him, Judge Bennett was the model of judicial decorum. Tall, eloquent, white-haired, and cleanly tailored in expensive robes that never wrinkled. His voice carried the soft firmness of a seasoned politician, and his smile was calculated wide enough to disarm, tight enough to remind you who held the gavel. But behind closed doors and beyond court transcripts, those who knew him best would admit, Bennett didn't just uphold the law, he personalized it. He had served on Maryland's circuit court for over 20 years, presiding over hundreds of trials and youth programs. On paper, he had mentored dozens of students across racial backgrounds. But the numbers told a different story. Over 80% of the black and brown students he mentored never made it past the first round of competitions under his supervision. White students, many from private schools, were disproportionately awarded top scores, even when their performances lacked rigor or originality. It was never overt. That was Bennett's skill. The racism was always dressed in etiquette. A misplaced compliment here, a helpful correction there, a laugh that lingered just a second too long when a black student stumbled. He was careful with words, always couching criticism in professional standards, always using tone to remind others of their place. 2 years ago, during the same oratory finals, a Latinx student named Amira Vega delivered a powerful reinterpretation of the 14th Amendment through the lens of immigration law. She cited landmark cases and concluded with an emotional plea for judicial empathy. Bennett had applauded, then added with a grin, "Excellent delivery. But remember, this is constitutional law, not a TED Talk." She was eliminated in the next round. Then there was Jalen Ross, a black senior who had argued that the Constitution's silence on economic inequality perpetuated systemic poverty. Bennett's feedback: "That's quite a creative interpretation. Though, let's stick to the actual text, shall we?" Jalen's score was the second lowest of the competition. He later transferred schools and never entered another competition again. Bennett's courtroom laugh, the one that humiliated Taria, wasn't spontaneous. It was rehearsed over years of microaggressions disguised as mentorship. But what made this moment different wasn't just who he laughed at, it was who was watching. Because this time, the courtroom wasn't just filled with judges and finalists. It was 2025, and everyone carried smartphones. One parent in the third row, a soft-spoken father from Howard County, had instinctively hit record when he saw the look on Taria's face after the mispronunciation. What he captured in under 30 seconds would soon ignite the internet like wildfire. Bennett's condescending chuckle, his use of sweetheart, the dismissive shake of his head, and then Taria's poised, chilling response, "Would you like me to recite the entire Constitution backwards?" The video, uploaded just an hour later, would trend in under 6. But Bennett didn't know that yet. He only knew that something in the air had shifted. Because as Taria's reverse recital reached its crescendo, something else was happening behind the walls of public professionalism. His authority, once armored by prestige, was visibly cracking. And what he didn't see, what made this moment so unprecedented, was who was sitting in the back row. Ms. Evelyn Grant, a retired federal judge known for her unapologetic critiques of judicial bias. She hadn't been on the official guest list, but she had a habit of showing up where justice needed eyes, and now her eyes were on him. Evelyn had heard whispers about Bennett before, quiet complaints from parents, frustrated murmurs from former clerks. She had let them sit until today, because now the proof wasn't anecdotal, it was digital. The courtroom wasn't just a venue anymore. It had become a crime scene of subtle racism, caught in 4K. And Bennett, for the first time in his career, looked like a man who could feel the ground beneath him shift. There's a saying in judicial circles, respect is earned, power is assumed. But what happens when the respect vanishes, and the power is questioned? Bennett looked down at his notes, then up at Taria. She hadn't broken eye contact. Not once. And in that stare, he saw not just a student but a mirror. A mirror that reflected every smirk he had ever weaponized, every opportunity he had quietly denied, every time he had mistaken a child's silence for ignorance. She was no longer on trial. He was. Because racism doesn't need to shout when it's already sitting on the bench. And just as he opened his mouth to interrupt, to regain control, to reassert his carefully polished persona, his courtroom assistant leaned toward him and whispered something that made his blood run cold. The video, it's online. But this time, someone was about to flip the script, and the judge would be the one forced to listen. Judge Bennett's expression was still draining of color as the whispered words echoed in his ear. The video, it's online. But by then, it was far too late to contain what had been unleashed. Because Taria Monroe was already mid-sentence, not in a breakdown, not in a tantrum, but in a precise, surgical dissection of the most revered legal document in American history. And she was doing it backwards. Granted powers the on infringed, not be shall which writes the to construed be shall not, Constitution, the by delegated states, the to reserved, are respectively, or people, the to retained, are others, the by retained powers, the 10th Amendment, reversed. Not one slip, not one hesitation. The courtroom was still, thick with something that felt sacred but uneasy, like a church realizing its preacher had been wrong all along. What had begun as a moment of casual humiliation had turned into a historical rupture. A 16-year-old black girl from inner-city Baltimore was taking the U.S. Constitution, a document used for centuries to exclude, silence, and subjugate, and reciting it in reverse order, with flawless clarity, as if each clause was branded into her bones. The judges sat motionless, their pens no longer scratching paper. The audience leaned forward unconsciously, caught in the gravitational pull of something they couldn't fully comprehend yet. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut like glass. Each article felt heavier than the last, not because of its content, but because of who was saying it. This was not a performance. It was a reclamation. The irony struck with violent grace. The very laws that once justified her ancestors' bondage were now spilling from her mouth like scripture, not to validate but to challenge. The same words that empowered plantation owners, denied citizenship, and rationalized segregation were being wielded by someone their authors never intended to include. Taria wasn't asking for space. She was repossessing it. Impeachment of case and convicted, be shall not but punishment, and office of removal the judgment. Article I, Section 3. Her cadence was steady, her breathing measured, almost ritualistic, and behind every word, centuries of pain flowed. Generations who had no access to the laws written over their lives. Men like her great-grandfather, who never got to see the Constitution as anything more than a tool of punishment. Women like her mother, who had taught her its flaws not out of reverence but out of survival. Judge Bennett blinked rapidly, his hand twitching near the microphone. He looked as though he might interrupt, but something held him back. Perhaps fear, perhaps shame, or maybe the growing realization that he no longer controlled the room. Even his fellow panelists, previously distant and unreadable, now sat in frozen awe. One judge, a woman with decades on the bench, lowered her head slightly, not out of judgment, but in recognition. It was as though she too felt the weight of history curling around the edges of Taria's voice. At the back of the room, Ms. Evelyn Grant shifted in her seat. Her hand slid into her purse, fingers curling around the business card she'd brought just in case. Her gaze never left Taria, and in that moment, she didn't see a child, she saw a reckoning. The students in the gallery stared, some with eyes wide, others with tears forming without permission. They weren't hearing a lecture. They were witnessing a revolution, made not of fire but of fact, of memory, of mastery. Because knowledge isn't just power, it's resistance wrapped in syllables. When she reached the final lines of the preamble, reversed like a prayer prayed back to its author, her voice slowed. America of States United thee in tranquility, domestic and welfare general the promote, liberty of blessings, these to ourselves and posterity are to secure justice establish union perfect a form more of in Constitution this ordain and establish we people. Then silence. But it wasn't emptiness. It was full, dense with reverence, unease, and recognition. It was the silence that follows truth when no one dares to argue. Taria didn't smile. She didn't bow. She simply stepped back, eyes steady, breath even, and returned to her place at the podium. A breath passed through the courtroom, collective, unintentional, like waking from a dream. Judge Bennett didn't move. His hands were clasped tightly, knuckles white. There was no reprimand, no applause, just a gavel resting silently beside his hand, unused, and now, perhaps, unworthy. Dana Monroe watched from the gallery, a single tear tracing her cheek as if it had waited years for permission to fall. She reached into her purse and gently touched an old photo of her father, whispering under her breath, "She did it, Daddy." She made them listen. And just when it seemed the moment had reached its peak, when the silence seemed too thick to be broken without collapsing the room, Taria spoke again. Not reciting, not performing, but revealing. "There's something I need to say," she began, her voice calm but sharp, like a blade drawn slowly. All eyes turned. "Before I came here today, I studied not just the Constitution, but the judicial records of everyone on this bench." Gasps, a collective inhalation. Her gaze landed directly on Judge Bennett. "And I found something about you. But this wasn't just about memorization, it was personal. But this wasn't just about memorization, it was personal." The courtroom had been silent. A silence that had cracked the very air. Thick, unspoken, trembling with the realization that something irreversible had just happened. But outside, beyond the courthouse doors, and echoing through the digital veins of the internet, the world was anything but quiet. It began with a 32-second clip. Shaky, grainy but unmistakably clear. Judge Bennett laughing, Taria standing, her voice steady, slicing through the room with, "Would you like me to recite the entire Constitution backwards?" Uploaded by a father who never expected the post to reach beyond his local parent group, the video exploded within hours. By sunset it had crossed platforms. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit. By midnight it was headline news. Taria speaks, reverse justice, and Constitution girl began trending globally. Within 24 hours, the clip had been viewed over 27 million times. News outlets scrambled for the full footage. The moment she began reciting the Constitution in reverse clause by clause, amendment by amendment, became instant lore. CNN called it the most powerful civic moment of the year. MSNBC hosted panels debating whether she was a symbol of youth resistance or an accidental icon. Fox News, not surprisingly, headlined with, "Teens outburst raises questions about respect in courtrooms." But for every panel, every think piece, every op-ed that tried to dissect the moment, one truth remained unshakable. A young black girl had walked into a space meant to exclude her, and took over the narrative without raising her voice. The reactions were not all praise. On Twitter, some responses were jubilant, emotional. She didn't flinch, she didn't beg. She educated the room that tried to belittle her. At Educate Her Now. "My 12-year-old just asked to learn the Constitution. Thank you, Taria." At Bleke Motherhood, unapologetic. But alongside the praise came the backlash, the coded comments, the veiled threats. If she spent less time memorizing and more time learning how to behave, maybe she'd be less angry. At Justice Always Won. "She embarrassed a judge. Shouldn't that be illegal?" At Blue Line Respecter. The line between admiration and antagonism blurred fast. Taria's school issued a vague statement celebrating all our students' commitment to civic engagement. A masterclass in neutrality that revealed more about their fear than their support. Her teachers, many of whom had quietly doubted her, now tripped over themselves in interviews to claim they'd always seen her potential. What no one expected was how young people responded. Across high schools in Atlanta, Detroit, Oakland, and Newark, students began forming Taria circles, informal after-school groups where teens met to memorize sections of the Constitution and reinterpret them through their lived experiences. Videos began flooding TikTok under the tag Our Constitution Too, featuring black and brown youth reciting amendments while standing in school gyms, public libraries, and on street corners. But not all recognition came from below. 3 days after the video went viral, Taria received an email from Professor Adeline Strauss, head of American Legal History at Yale Law School. "Miss Monroe, your recitation was not only impressive, it was revolutionary. I'd like to invite you to speak at our upcoming symposium on civic literacy and social justice." Attached was an offer, an all-expenses-paid trip to Connecticut, a keynote speaking slot, and access to a network most kids her age couldn't dream of. Her mother read the email aloud, hands trembling, tears streaming, not out of pride but something deeper, vindication. Taria didn't answer right away. Because even as the world celebrated her voice, she was beginning to see what it cost to be heard. She wasn't sleeping much. Her inbox was filled with thousands of messages, fan mail, interview requests, but also hate, some just words, some darker. One email read, "You think you're special? You're just another loudmouth. We'll see how long this act lasts." A letter arrived, handwritten, with no return address. Inside, a single burned page of the Constitution. Dana contacted a family friend and law enforcement. "Just in case," she said, barely above a whisper. But she knew the truth. When a black girl becomes a symbol, she also becomes a target. Still, Taria refused to flinch. She agreed to an interview, just one. A local reporter from the Baltimore Tribune who had followed her school journey long before she went viral. The interview aired late Sunday night, soft lighting, no frills. The reporter asked, "What made you memorize the Constitution backward?" Taria looked directly into the lens, calm but piercing. "Because I knew one day someone would laugh at me. I just didn't know it would be a judge. I wanted to be ready." A pause. "This isn't about revenge. It's about memory. My people weren't allowed to read, to learn, to speak in court. So now I'll say what they couldn't, until everyone hears them." The clip went viral again. In the age of algorithms, truth only needs one spark. By the end of the week, national education boards debated whether civic literacy needed reform. Podcasts and book clubs re-examined the Constitution. Public discourse shifted, not drastically but undeniably. A tremor in the foundation. And at the center of it all stood a girl who had once been overlooked in every classroom. But with fame came something darker, and it arrived in a plain manila envelope on a rainy Thursday. Inside, a printed photo of Taria standing at the podium, scrawled across the top in red ink. "You should have stayed silent. But every hero attracts enemies." The manila envelope sat on the kitchen counter for hours before Dana dared to open it. It wasn't just the absence of a return address or the smudged ink on the label that unsettled her. It was the weight of it, as if the paper itself carried more than just words. And it did. Inside was a high-resolution printout of her daughter, standing before the bench in her courtroom uniform, posture upright, eyes bold. Across the top, scrawled in red marker, "You should have stayed silent." No signature, no stamp, no smudges, just a message as clear as it was chilling. Dana stared at the photo until her fingers began to tremble. She didn't want to believe it, but the pit in her stomach wasn't new. It had been growing since the moment the video went viral. Taria had pierced the veil of polite racism, and now it was fighting back the only way it knew how, from the shadows. She didn't show it to Taria. Not yet. But it wasn't the only message. By the next morning, 3 more emails arrived, unsigned, using scrambled IP addresses and anonymous remailers. One simply read, "Patriots remember." Another included a doctored image of Judge Bennett shaking hands with Taria, her face replaced with a black caricature from the Jim Crow era. The third was shorter, cruder. "No place for you in our court." Dana reported the messages, of course. She called the police, forwarded the emails, even spoke with a cybersecurity liaison provided by a civil rights organization. But the responses were procedural, polite, and ultimately powerless. "We'll look into it." Nothing directly actionable here. Could just be internet trolls. Could be, but what if they weren't? Meanwhile, Taria kept moving forward. She prepared for the Yale Symposium. She wrote back to students across the country who had flooded her inbox with gratitude and stories of their own silencing. She organized Zoom calls with young debaters in Milwaukee, New Orleans, and Oakland. But Dana could see it, the weariness creeping in. The smile that didn't reach her daughter's eyes, the glances over her shoulder when walking home. The world had made Taria a symbol. Now it was trying to break the girl behind it. What made it worse was how quickly the institutions that once celebrated her began to retreat. Her school, the same one that posted a carefully worded statement when the video first gained traction, had grown unusually quiet. When Taria's name was nominated for a Civic Excellence Award, the administration held a closed-door meeting. Her nomination was pulled the next day, citing concerns about fairness and public perception. Taria was told privately by a counselor, "They just don't want the school to look biased." Biased. The irony was venomous. But it didn't stop there. A leaked memo from the district superintendent's office included a line that sent a shiver through Dana's spine. "We must ensure students do not feel emboldened to challenge authority under the guise of civic engagement." The narrative was shifting. Suddenly, Taria wasn't a brilliant young scholar. She was controversial, a disruptor, a discipline risk. Teachers whispered behind closed doors. One parent complained to the PTA that their child felt uncomfortable sharing a classroom with a political figure. And at the center of it all was Judge Bennett. Faced with national scrutiny, Bennett issued a public statement 2 weeks after the incident, but it was laced with coded civility. In an academic setting, emotions can sometimes cloud judgment. While I maintain the importance of respectful decorum, I regret if my tone was misinterpreted as anything other than professional guidance. Misinterpreted. Not regret, not apology, just a deflection wrapped in court-approved language. The worst part? Many believed him. Cable panels applauded his measured response. Local editorials called for forgiveness and moving forward. And quietly, whispers began that perhaps Taria had overreacted, that maybe she had embarrassed him deliberately, that perhaps she hadn't been humiliated, she had just played it smart. The script was flipping, but not in her favor. And still, the threats came. A smashed egg left on their porch one morning. No note, just the silent mocking decay. Taria picked it up herself, gloves on, her jaw tight. She didn't cry. She just said, "They're wasting groceries." But Dana saw it. The way her daughter's hands trembled when she thought no one was watching. Racism doesn't always wear a hood. Sometimes it hides behind keyboards and policies, behind PTA meetings and polite applause. And when it's cornered, it doesn't retreat. It regroups. But amid the fear, amid the exhaustion, something shifted. A call came late one night. The number unfamiliar. Dana almost didn't answer. "Mrs. Monroe?" a woman's voice said. Firm, calm. "Yes," Dana replied, her body going cold. "This is Evelyn Grant, former federal judge." Dana's breath hitched. "I saw what your daughter did," Grant continued, "and I saw what they're doing now. I'm not calling as a fan. I'm calling because she needs protection and a platform. I'd like to meet her." Someone unexpected reaches out to Taria. The envelope was old, not in age, but in style. Cream-colored, with careful cursive handwriting that looked like it had traveled through time. Dana handed it to Taria one quiet afternoon, just after school, when the weight of the week had finally settled into silence. Her mother said nothing, only nodded toward the return address in the top corner. Selma, Alabama. Taria opened it slowly, her fingers brushing over the unfamiliar texture. Inside was a single, handwritten letter, penned in deep blue ink on thick parchment. No typed lines, no social media tags, just words carved by memory. "Dear Ms. Monroe, I watched your video, watched it again, then again, not for entertainment, but for confirmation. You reminded me of another young girl I once knew. Different time, same fire. My name is Reverend Charles C.J. Lawton. I marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965. I was jailed in Montgomery. I was beaten in Birmingham. I was told I'd never be heard. And then, I heard you. Keep going. The road you're walking has blood on it, but it leads to something holy." Attached was a faded photograph, black and white. 4 teenagers, arms locked, crossing the bridge, one of them unmistakably younger, with eyes that mirrored Taria's, determined, burdened, electric with defiance. Taria read the letter twice, then a third time, until the ink blurred. Not from age, but from her tears. She didn't speak about it right away, didn't post it, didn't show anyone outside her home. Some moments were too sacred for clicks. But 2 weeks later, she and Dana flew to Alabama. They were met at the airport by a local historian who had volunteered to be their guide. Her name was Miss Lena Hollis, a retired professor with the kind of voice that could fold time. "I don't do tours," she said softly. "I do awakenings." Their first stop was the Legacy Museum in Montgomery. The halls smelled like cedar and solemnity. Displays showed chains used in the transatlantic slave trade, letters from imprisoned freedom riders, a wall of soil from lynching sites. Each exhibit pressed into Taria's chest like a quiet scream. At the from enslavement to mass incarceration corridor, she stood still for nearly 15 minutes before whispering, "This isn't just history, it's a mirror." Lena nodded. "A mirror that cracks people open, if they let it." They traveled next to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where Reverend Lawton had marched 6 decades before. The sun was soft that day, filtered by cloud and memory. Taria stood at the edge, her fingers tracing the cool steel of the rail. Below, the Alabama River flowed slow and wide, like it remembered too much. She closed her eyes. For a moment she heard it. Not voices, not traffic, but the pulse of resistance. Footsteps, shouts, the beating of courage against fear. And in that space she understood something she hadn't yet spoken aloud. She wasn't the beginning. She was the continuation. The civil rights leaders of the 60s weren't shadows to her anymore. They were co-authors of her present. Their chants had cleared the ground she now walked on. Their scars were maps she didn't yet know how to read. But she would. When she finally met Reverend Lawton at a small Baptist church tucked into the heart of Selma, the air felt thick with reverence. He was 84 now, lean, slow-moving, but sharp-eyed. His hands shook only when still, but when he embraced her they were steady as a verdict. "You turned that courtroom into a sanctuary," he said, pulling back to look her in the eyes, "and made them pray whether they wanted to or not." They spoke for hours, not about the viral video, not about fame, but about burden, about the cost of being seen. Lawton told her about the friends he buried before 20, about the fear that never left his bones. But he also told her about the power of reclaiming space, not with volume, but with precision. Courage, he said, is when history meets clarity. And girl, you got both. Back at the hotel, Taria sat on the edge of her bed, the letter folded neatly beside her, and thought about the weight of it all. The online noise had faded slightly, not gone, just quieter. But now a deeper echo was growing inside her. This wasn't about correcting a judge anymore. It was about correcting a country's memory. When she returned to Baltimore, something had changed. Not externally. The threats still came. The school remained silent. Bennett still untouched. But inside she had recalibrated. She wasn't running from the stage. She was preparing to build her own. And that moment arrived faster than expected. 3 days after returning from Selma, she received an email. The subject line was short. Invitation. National Civic Forum. Keynote slot opened. The sender. The Department of Education, in collaboration with several civil rights foundations. The event? A nationally televised forum on youth activism and legal literacy, scheduled in D.C., steps away from the Supreme Court itself. Taria read the email 5 times. Her hand hovered over the keyboard. Dana stood behind her, saying nothing, just resting a hand on her shoulder. You're not just being heard anymore, she whispered. You're being asked to lead. Taria is offered a national stage. The Capitol building stood like a fortress of legacy, gleaming columns, guarded entrances, and an air that reeked of both grandeur and exclusion. For most people, entering its chambers meant power. For Taria Monroe, it meant a confrontation. Not just with the nation's lawmakers, but with the nation's lies. Her name was now inked on a polished brass nameplate in front of a microphone she hadn't asked for. The National Youth Civic Forum had slotted her into the keynote section of the congressional hearing on the state of constitutional literacy and educational equity. It sounded noble, bureaucratically hollow, but behind its language she knew what this really was. Damage control. The hearing chamber was larger than she imagined, carved in white stone, flanked with flags and seal-embossed furniture. Rows of elected officials sat in semicircle formation, pens poised, expressions guarded. Their nameplates glittered under the light. Congresswoman Reyes from California, Senator Malloy from Massachusetts, and directly across from her, Representative Halderman of Georgia, whose record on voting rights read like a slow-motion rollback of everything her ancestors had bled for. And yet, it wasn't fear that clenched her stomach. It was clarity. Because this wasn't a platform. It was a courtroom. And America, her contradictions, her silence, her denial, was on trial. Taria adjusted the mic. Cameras zoomed in. Viewers across the country leaned forward, and she began. Members of Congress, I am not here because I won a competition. I am not here because I'm exceptional. I'm here because someone laughed, not at my mistake, but at my presence. Silence. You called this hearing to talk about civic literacy, but the truth is, it was never about what students know. It's about what adults refuse to teach. It's about who gets to define the Constitution and who the Constitution chooses to forget. Gasps fluttered, murmurs, a few scribbled notes with urgency. I memorized the Constitution backward not to impress you. I did it because I needed to understand the language used to justify my people's pain. I learned the law not for protection but for translation. Because too often when black students speak, we are told our voices are too loud, too angry, too political. Representative Halderman leaned back, arms crossed. I was raised to believe the Constitution belonged to me. But every history book, every test, every judge who called me sweetheart told me otherwise. So I learned it word for word, and then I flipped it clause by clause until it made sense to me. The room shifted. Some nodded. Others bristled. Cameras flashed. Networks live-streamed. Twitter erupted. The Constitution isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. Serve those who wrote it. My generation isn't here to recite it. We're here to rewrite what it means to be American. The silence that followed was volcanic. One congresswoman clapped slowly. Another cleared his throat. Halderman leaned toward his mic. Miss Monroe, he said, a thin smile on his lips. With all due respect, this is a hearing, not a protest. Perhaps it would be more helpful if you offered policy recommendations rather than, he paused, searching for the word, rhetoric. Taria didn't blink. My policy recommendation is simple. Stop pretending black students need to be fixed. Fix the systems that erase us. The room broke. Some members clapped. Others whispered in disbelief. One official muttered something into his aide's ear and left the chamber. Dana watched from the gallery, heart clenched. Not in fear, but in awe. Her daughter wasn't bending. She was dismantling. Outside the chamber, Social media exploded again. Taria in Congress. Rewrite America. Not your sweetheart. Cable networks played sound bites on a loop. Conservative pundits scrambled to label her manipulated, scripted, disrespectful, but even they couldn't look away. And then just as the hearing closed, something unexpected happened. A second panel was announced, this one closed door. Its subject, judicial conduct and racial bias in educational jurisprudence. And the first name under review, Judge Raymond Bennett. Word had spread, the video was only the surface, investigative journalists had started digging. Old rulings, questionable scores, quiet complaints, all resurfacing. Evelyn Grant, the retired judge who had supported Taria, had submitted a formal affidavit requesting a full ethics inquiry into Bennett's conduct. His name had gone from respected to radioactive. But as Taria stood to leave the chamber, a congressional aide slipped a note into her hand. It read, "Request for second testimony, judiciary oversight, judge under review, Raymond Bennett." Judge Bennett's seat becomes the hottest one in the room. Judge Raymond Bennett had once been the symbol of quiet authority, his name whispered with reverence in courthouse halls, his rulings cited in legal journals as examples of judicial restraint. He wore his robe like armor, his smile like a closing argument. But now, with Taria Monroe's words still echoing in the Capitol, that robe had begun to unravel, and beneath it the secrets long hidden were beginning to speak. The congressional aide's note wasn't just ceremonial. Within hours, a second hearing was scheduled, confidential, off-record, yet attended by ethics officials and civil rights attorneys. At the center of the agenda was one name, Judge Raymond Bennett. Taria didn't testify immediately. Others came first. A former courtroom clerk, Jordan Sykes, now in his 30s, stepped forward. Nervous but resolute, he shared how Bennett routinely gave harsher verbal critiques to black students during educational programs. He'd smile at them while cutting them down, Jordan said, and he'd always make sure it sounded reasonable. His voice trembled when he described a young black boy, just 13, who cried after Bennett mocked his reading of the Emancipation Proclamation. The judge called it emotionally indulgent, said the boy was performing trauma. Jordan paused. But when a white girl sang "God Bless America" the following week, he gave her a standing ovation. Then came Lucinda Holt, a legal researcher who had once served on a scholarship committee Bennett chaired. Her affidavit detailed instances where black applicants were flagged for unusual tone or lack of polish, even when their scores matched or exceeded their white peers. One sentence in her statement silenced the room. He didn't reject them for being unqualified. He rejected them for not being deferential. The pattern was deliberate. The bias wasn't implicit. It was practiced. Meanwhile, a group of investigative journalists from an independent watchdog had begun publishing archived decisions from Bennett's courtroom. Over 2 decades of youth court cases showed a measurable discrepancy in sentencing between white and black juveniles, especially in nonviolent offenses. The numbers were chilling. For minor infractions like shoplifting or disorderly conduct, white youth were diverted to educational programs 62% of the time. Black youth were diverted only 18%. One headline read, "Judge Bennett, the smile behind the sentences." Another, "From mockery to misdemeanors, a hidden pattern of judicial bias." Yet even as evidence mounted, a different machinery began to move, quieter, older, and much harder to uproot. A private legal coalition, anonymous in funding but powerful in influence, began crafting narratives. Editorials appeared overnight in moderate outlets. We must not mistake performative outrage for justice. Television pundits warned about destroying careers over misinterpreted intentions. Former colleagues of Bennett stepped up with glowing testimonials. He was always courteous. He's guided hundreds of students, many of them minorities. We can't start crucifying judges every time a clip goes viral. And just like that, the system began preparing to protect its own. Internal memos from the Judicial Ethics Committee leaked, full of hesitancy, phrases like insufficiently documented misconduct and lack of clear statutory violation. A panelist even proposed that Bennett retire with dignity to avoid further politicization. But the tide wasn't turning in their favor as easily this time. Because the court of public opinion, led by voices like Taria's, was louder than expected. Students held silent protests in front of courthouses, taping reversed lines from the Constitution across their mouths. Teachers read aloud the transcript of Taria's speech during morning announcements, risking reprimand. The hashtag Bennett behind the bench surged across platforms. Dana received an anonymous tip. A former assistant judge emailed her a sealed folder with digital copies of internal performance reviews going back 10 years. In it, repeated concerns about Bennett's tone, tendency to belittle, and inconsistent sentencing logic. None of it had ever been acted upon. She printed them and placed them in a binder marked for Congress. Taria stayed mostly silent during this phase. She didn't need to speak. She had already lit the match. And now others, long silenced, were using the flame to find their way forward. One evening, as she sat in her room reading an article on judicial accountability, Dana entered, holding a letter, hand-delivered, no return address. Just one name written on the front in a neat cursive script. Taria. She opened it slowly. The first line stopped her breath.
I know the truth is coming, so let me tell you mine first.
It was from Judge Raymond Bennett. The system prepares to protect its own, but the judge just made his next move. Someone unexpected reaches out to Taria. The envelope from Judge Bennett sat on Taria's nightstand for 2 days before she touched it again. Whatever confession or manipulation it held, she knew instinctively it wasn't going to be a surrender. It would be a weapon dressed as an olive branch. And she wasn't wrong. Inside, the letter was written in Bennett's signature style, polished, precise, and dripping with selective remorse. Dear Ms. Monroe, what transpired in the courtroom was regrettable. Not for its optics, but for the disruption it caused to the credibility of institutions we both hold dear. I commend your passion, though I fear your approach has been weaponized by those with agendas far beyond you. I hope for your sake that you find a way to rejoin the world of constructive civic engagement and not be consumed by it. There it was, not an apology, a veiled warning. The message was clear: fall in line or be devoured. And then the storm began. It started with a viral tweet from a faceless account claiming to be a former classmate of Taria. It alleged she had cheated on standardized tests and had been caught plagiarizing an essay in 9th grade. No evidence, no identity, just a claim. Within hours, it was picked up by fringe blogs. Screenshots of fabricated disciplinary reports were posted. One headline read, "The Truth About America's Favorite Teen Revolutionary." Another, "Courtroom Genius Caught Lying About Her Academic Record." At first, Dana and Taria laughed. The lies were so outrageous, they assumed they'd collapse under their own weight. But they didn't. Because soon, the lies evolved. A video surfaced, a deepfake of Taria at a school rally supposedly yelling anti-American slogans. The voice didn't sound like hers. The mouth didn't quite sync. But in a world trained to consume headlines faster than facts, truth became a luxury. Cable news anchors began using phrases like troubling revelations, emerging details, and possible misconduct. School officials, when contacted for clarification, said only, "We are conducting an internal review." No defense, no support, just institutional retreat. Then came the file. One morning, Taria's guidance counselor called her into the office, fidgeting with an envelope that bore the school's letterhead. "I don't know how to say this," he said, eyes darting away. "Your permanent record has been flagged for academic integrity concerns." Dana was called in. They demanded specifics, but the counselor was vague. "These documents were submitted to us from an anonymous district source. They included falsified grade changes, doctored emails from teachers questioning her work ethic, even a forged letter suggesting Taria had once threatened disruption during a school assembly." It was surreal. A character assassination unfolding in real time, meticulously crafted to look official, a false history being built to bury a true one. Dana stormed out with the file in hand. She called their lawyer. She contacted media outlets. But by the time rebuttals were prepared, the story had legs. Major outlets were now investigating. Sponsors for the Civic Forum began reconsidering their affiliations. 2 scholarships quietly revoked their invitations. And amid all this, Judge Bennett remained silent, no longer smiling, but now standing in the shadows, letting others do his bidding. Because this wasn't about proving Taria wrong. It was about making people doubt she was ever right. The coordinated attacks weren't random. They were strategic discreditation, a method used for decades to destroy Black activists. Change the story, taint the image, seed the doubt. By the time the target responds, the damage is already public record. For Taria, the impact wasn't external. It wasn't the canceled appearances or slanderous headlines that cut deepest. It was the look on her favorite teacher's face when she hesitated before saying, "We believe you." That pause, however small, was betrayal. Because the truth threatens those who've survived on lies. Still, Taria didn't break. She spent nights with legal teams, cybersecurity analysts, and advocacy groups. Digital forensics confirmed the videos were manipulated. Expert witnesses debunked the school file documents. Her academic integrity was restored in record time. But the damage to public trust? That couldn't be reversed so quickly. Then came the unexpected twist. One of the anonymous whistleblowers, someone embedded inside the digital smear campaign, contacted Evelyn Grant. The message was brief but explosive. There's a data cache, internal messages, emails, directives. Bennett's network isn't just old, it's connected. And it's traceable. A second envelope arrived at Dana's door, this one full of screenshots. Strings of internal emails between legal consultants, lobbyists, and district officials. Discussions about neutralizing Monroe's influence. Recommendations to muddy her record. Even talk of paying students to create chaotic first-hand accounts. One email, dated just days after her congressional speech, was titled, "Contain the narrative before it spreads further." Dana stared at the paper, shaking. Taria, calmer than she should have been, whispered, "They think they're fighting a child, but I've got something they don't." "What's that?" her mother asked, afraid of the answer. Taria turned, her voice low but electric. "Evidence. And a live mic. But Taria has one last card to play." Taria's voice hit the mic like a spark to dry grass. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was deliberate, measured in tone but eruptive in consequence. She had been invited onto a national morning broadcast under the guise of correcting misinformation. The anchor was seasoned, careful with her language, polished to perfection. "Ms. Monroe, are you saying there's a coordinated attempt to silence you?" the anchor asked, her smile polite but taut. Taria looked straight into the camera, a single folder in her lap. "No," she replied. "I'm saying I can prove it." And then she opened it. Emails, messages, directives, dozens, all verified by digital forensics, with timestamps, authors, and digital signatures. She didn't shout. She didn't dramatize. She just laid the facts bare. "This isn't just about me. It's about the architecture of erasure. How systems respond when someone they expected to fail refuses to play along." That moment, live, uncensored, and undeniable, tore through the nation. By the end of the day, clips from the interview had reached over 60 million views. Hashtags like "Expose the Bench," "She Brought Receipts," and "Erase No More" dominated every platform. But what happened next couldn't be predicted by any algorithm. Across the country, Black youth began speaking up. In Jackson, Mississippi, a 13-year-old named Davion filmed himself reading aloud the 14th Amendment while standing outside a courthouse where his cousin had been sentenced without legal representation. In Minneapolis, 2 high school seniors rewrote the Constitution into slam poetry, performing it at their school's assembly. Unapproved, uninvited, unstoppable. In Chicago, a group of middle schoolers held a silent Constitution protest, holding signs with reversed clauses written in Sharpie, mouths taped shut. Videos poured in, confessions from students wrongly disciplined, stories of teachers who mispronounced their names on purpose, stories of school administrators who called the police before calling parents. The injustice wasn't new, but for the first time it had a unifying language, the Constitution itself.
They weren't reciting it to honor it.
They were reciting it to reclaim it. A phrase began circulating among the youth protests. "If we know the laws, we can name the lies." The movement had a name now, not constitutional literacy as civil protest. It wasn't about rebellion for the sake of it. It was about confronting the hypocrisy of being taught to love a document that never loved them back. And at its epicenter stood a girl who had once been told to sit down and smile. But this time, no one was sitting. By the second week of nationwide action, over 400 student-led walkouts had taken place. Hundreds of schools were flooded with Freedom of Information requests filed by student groups demanding transparency on disciplinary records. Libraries reported a 300% spike in requests for constitutional law materials. Even conservative media couldn't ignore it anymore. They attempted to paint the movement as youth-driven radicalism, but their attacks only fueled the fire. In Atlanta, a group of Black law students hosted free legal literacy workshops for teens. In Oakland, a retired Black judge donated an entire collection of legal texts to community centers. In New York, a group of parents formed an advocacy council demanding judicial oversight and the removal of bias from school discipline protocols. The system had tried to erase one girl's voice, and now a generation had found its own. Meanwhile, Taria, now both symbol and strategist, continued her work behind the scenes. She formed a civic task force with Evelyn Grant and several education leaders. She declined sponsorships, rejected corporate branding attempts, and released a public statement. "This movement isn't mine to own, it's ours to protect. If they can corrupt my story, they can buy yours. Stay loud, stay local, stay literate." But amid all the momentum, something quietly shifted. A package arrived at Dana's apartment. This one official, sealed in gold foil, hand-delivered by a congressional liaison. Inside, a formal letter, printed on embossed parchment. We, the Joint Committee on National Honors, do hereby recognize the unmatched contributions of Ms. Taria Monroe to youth civic engagement, constitutional literacy, and educational equity. Dana gasped. Taria stood still. And formally submit her name for nomination to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. For a moment, the world stilled. It wasn't the medal itself, it was what it represented. An honor that had eluded activists far more seasoned, far more protected. To offer it now, amid ongoing backlash, open investigations and coordinated silencing, felt like a contradiction. But it also felt like a moment of reckoning. Could the same system that tried to erase her now be forced to honor her? Dana sat on the edge of the bed, folding the letter with care. "Do you know what this means?" she asked softly. Taria nodded. Her eyes didn't leave the letter. "It means they're watching. All of them. The ones who hate me. The ones who fear me. The ones who never expected a girl like me to make it to their radar." She paused, then looked up. "But they forgot one thing." Dana tilted her head. "What's that?" "I wasn't trying to be famous. I was trying to be heard. Now that they've heard me, they'll never unhear us. Taria is nominated for something unthinkable." The invitation came not with a press release or viral post, but in a quiet letter stamped with the seal of the United States Department of Education. It was addressed not to Dana, not to Miss Monroe, but to Taria A. Monroe, Youth Policy Advisor, Provisional. The ink was still drying, but the history it marked was already sealed. Weeks after the announcement of her Presidential Medal of Freedom nomination, a bipartisan coalition of education and justice officials made another unprecedented move. They established the National Youth Advisory Council on Equity, Education, and Constitutional Literacy, and at the head of the list of founding members was a name that had once been a hashtag, now etched into policy. Taria Monroe wasn't a guest anymore. She was policy. The council was more than symbolic. With a direct advisory pipeline to the Department of Education and Justice, it was tasked with reviewing systemic inequities in civic education and recommending reforms to address racial bias in school discipline, curriculum standards, and civic engagement frameworks. Taria wasn't a checkbox of diversity. She was the blueprint. At the first council meeting, held in a quiet government building 2 blocks from the Capitol, she arrived wearing a pin her mother gave her, small bronze shaped like a microphone. The seats were filled with other youth leaders from across the country, Native activists from Arizona, undocumented students from California, formerly incarcerated youth from Chicago. They weren't polished. They were raw, brilliant, unfiltered. And they looked at her not with awe, but recognition. Because they didn't see a celebrity. They saw a comrade. Taria opened her first remarks with a simple declaration. "We're not here to fix a system that's allergic to truth. We're here to build something new with our scars as blueprints." Silence, then standing applause. Outside the room, her name appeared in government briefs, media articles, and law school syllabi. High school textbooks began including a unit on civic protest through constitutional literacy. Some called it the Monroe Framework. One university launched a scholarship in her name. A major publisher offered her a book deal. But Taria declined all commercial offers. She didn't want to be branded. She wanted impact. So instead, she launched a youth-led nonprofit, Amend Us. Its mission to empower Black and marginalized youth to reinterpret the Constitution through community-led education and real-time legal advocacy. It offered workshops, legal toolkits, digital campaigns, and pro bono partnerships with lawyers across the country. The logo was simple, an ink quill turning into a raised fist. Within 6 months, over 80,000 students had participated in Amend Us workshops. Still, the recognition came slowly from institutions. Some embraced the change, others tolerated it, a few resisted. But one by one, acknowledgments began to arrive, quiet but seismic. Her high school, once silent, issued a public apology. The principal resigned amid a district-wide investigation into discriminatory record-keeping. Teachers who once questioned her intellect now taught her analysis as required reading. The Maryland Judicial Review Board released a formal report on Bennett's conduct, citing a pattern of racial bias masked in professional performance. He was stripped of his educational leadership posts and placed under ethics sanction. His resignation followed 3 weeks later. The man who laughed first now exited last. Still, Taria didn't celebrate. Because even as doors opened, she understood. Justice was not a finish line. It was a negotiation. Daily. Relentless. "People think it's over," she told Dana one night, sitting on their porch as sirens passed in the distance. "They think it's a happy ending." Dana looked at her, the same girl she once rocked to sleep after police raided the wrong apartment down the hall. "What do you think it is?" "It's the first breath after nearly drowning." But not everyone was breathing easy. One morning, a package arrived without a return address. It wasn't threatening, it was worse. Inside was a thick file, a case archive, transcripts from a 1998 juvenile court trial. Attached was a note. If she's going to build a better system, she might want to know what the old one buried. The case involved a 14-year-old black boy sentenced to 18 months in juvenile detention for attempted property damage. No weapon, no theft, just suspicion, and a bag of markers. The judge listed in the transcript, Raymond Bennett. What stood out wasn't the sentence, it was the tone. The transcript showed Bennett dismissing the child's public defender, overruling objections, and using language that dehumanized the boy on record. He called the child directionless, a risk to civilized peers, and unaware of the value of American decency. It was one of many rulings. Buried, forgotten. Taria stared at the pages, hands cold. This wasn't history. This was a blueprint for erasure, and it was still being used. She scanned the case number into a national database. Dozens more appeared. A pattern, a strategy, a hidden architecture of legalized exclusion, crafted through legitimate rulings, designed not to punish crime, but to shape statistics, ruin futures, and preserve appearances. She had seen this system crumble. But now she saw how it rebuilt itself, silently, surgically. He didn't just mock me, she whispered. He systematized me. Dana placed a hand on her shoulder. What will you do? Taria folded the file. I'm going to court. But justice has a long memory, and so does vengeance. The courtroom where it had all begun was quieter now. Not because the noise had faded, but because something heavier had settled. The weight of public scrutiny, the tension of unfinished reckoning. The seats once packed with youth and teachers and whispered disbelief were now filled with cameras, journalists, and an uneasy stillness. Judge Raymond Bennett was resigning. The official reason was health and personal clarity, but the whispers said otherwise. A strategic retreat, crafted carefully to preserve legacy, avoid formal disbarment, and maintain the illusion of dignity. The ethics sanctions had weakened his influence. The leaked evidence had gutted his reputation. But this speech, this moment, was still his. He stood at the bench, robes neatly pressed, voice smooth, practiced. I have served this court for over 2 decades, he began, eyes scanning the room, never quite meeting Taria's. My intention has always been to guide, not to harm. But in times like these, perception can become weapon, and truth, a casualty. The reporters scribbled furiously. I leave my post not in disgrace, but in disappointment. Not for myself, but for how quickly this nation turns on those who serve it. There it was, the deflection masquerading as humility. Then his voice lowered, just slightly. I hope truly that those who come after me understand that order is not the enemy of freedom, and that correction is not cruelty. His eyes flicked, briefly to Taria. And to the young, brilliant voices rising now, may they rise with care. Because fire, even when righteous, still burns the hand that lights it. A veiled threat, draped in judicial poetry. He stepped down. No apology, no acknowledgement, just exit. The room clapped, politely, some out of formality, some out of discomfort, none for joy. Taria watched him leave, her fists clenched in her lap. She should have felt victorious, but instead she felt hollow. In the days that followed, media hailed the resignation as a step toward accountability. Commentators declared a moral win. Even allies began asking her, "Do you feel closure now?" As if the ending had been wrapped in ribbon. As if silence from power was the same thing as justice. But inside her something churned. Because forgiveness and accountability are not twins, they are rivals. And she was caught between them. Dana saw it in her daughter's face. That quiet war behind her eyes. That tension between legacy and rage. Between grace and vengeance. Between being the bigger person and being a full person. One night, as they sat on the porch, Dana asked, what would it take to forgive him? Taria didn't answer at first. Then she said, if he stood on the same stage he mocked me on and admitted what he did. Dana exhaled. And if he doesn't? Taria stared into the distance, the night wind curling around her braids. Then he'll be the lesson, not the warning. What complicated it further was the public. Some people wanted blood, others wanted reconciliation. Letters poured in, some thanking her for her restraint, others asking why she hadn't been more graceful. Even Black community leaders were divided. A few encouraged her to set an example by forgiving. A few told her to never let the fire die. She was no longer a girl. She was a symbol. And symbols, she realized, don't get to grieve, they just glow. At an awards gala for youth leadership, where she was being honored. A former civil rights leader approached her during the reception. He was soft-spoken, older, with hands scarred from marches and arrests. "I saw what you did," he said. "It was clean. Brilliant." "Thank you," she replied, unsure. He leaned in closer. "But be careful, child. Justice is not clean, it's messy. Human, it's tears and teeth, and staying when you want to run. Sometimes forgiveness makes you the liar. Sometimes resistance makes you the truth." She stood silent as he walked away, the words echoing long after he disappeared into the crowd. Days later, Bennett released an op-ed in a major paper. The title, "The Price of Progress: Reflections from a Judge Who Loved Too Much." In it, he painted himself as a misunderstood guide, someone who challenged young minds with firmness, who was dragged down by the mob of digital outrage, and who fears we are losing respect for order in our pursuit of raw emotional justice. The piece was shared widely, praised in some circles, used by school boards to justify keeping controversial staff in place, quoted by think tanks, referenced by politicians eager to restore balance. Taria read it once. Then she closed her laptop and opened a blank notebook. She began drafting a new curriculum, one not for schools but for youth courts, a module titled Justice, Clean in Theory, Bloody in Practice. She didn't just want to change laws anymore. She wanted to teach how laws are weaponized and how to disarm them. But just as she was finishing the first section, Dana called her from the living room. An envelope had arrived, no return address, again. Inside, not a threat, not a file, but a single photograph of Bennett in an unfamiliar courtroom, sitting on the witness stand, with a note. "You're not the only one who kept receipts." The final twist is yet to come. The National Archives stood like a temple of memory, its grand marble facade casting shadows that whispered of wars, treaties, revolutions, and contradictions. On that spring morning, thousands gathered on its steps, their breath caught between reverence and anticipation. Some carried signs, others wore shirts bearing Taria's face, her words, her silence. The crowd stretched far beyond the reflecting pool, a sea of resolve born not from chaos but from clarity. Inside, beneath the rotunda, the air was sacred. The original U.S. Constitution sat in its case, lit from beneath as if heaven itself hovered over it. Tourists usually walked past it in silence, reverent but disconnected. Today that silence carried weight, because they weren't just here to witness a document, they were here to witness a correction. Taria stood at the base of the exhibit, flanked not by guards or scholars, but by youth, students who had flown in from every corner of the country. Girls from Detroit, boys from Baton Rouge, queer teens from the Bronx, undocumented valedictorians from Arizona. Not one of them was silent anymore. The stage was simple, a single microphone, no podium, no banners, just the Constitution, and the girl who once turned it into a battlefield. Cameras rolled, live streams exploded, hashtags trended before she opened her mouth. She looked out across the crowd, not nervous, not triumphant, but still. And then she began. Amendment 27, no law varying the compensation for the services of the senators and representatives. The words flowed backward, article by article, amendment by amendment, each phrase uncoiled in reverse, like a spell being undone. There was no applause between sections, just stillness. Because this was not a performance. It was a reckoning. Each syllable she spoke pulled history forward, tugged it out of its shell, made it accountable. Every reversed clause was a reminder. The laws that once enslaved, silenced, erased, they were now being recited by their descendants. A black girl, standing before the very ink that once ignored her bloodline. Some in the audience wept, quietly, shoulders trembling. Others clutched their chests, not in grief but in recognition. The air itself seemed to tremble. When she reached the preamble, the crowd instinctively leaned in. Liberty of blessings, the to ourselves and posterity, are to secure, welfare general, the promote, tranquility, domestic, ensure, justice, establish, union perfect, a form more, in states united the, of people the, we. Silence followed. Not because she was finished, but because something had been returned. Not the Constitution, but ownership of it. Taria looked out into the crowd. The camera panned wide. The flag above her fluttered, not in triumph but in surrender. Then she spoke one final line, not backward, not rehearsed, just true. I didn't come to remember history. I came to fix it. The words detonated across the plaza. Thunderous applause erupted, but it wasn't celebration. It was affirmation, that the moment was not symbolic. It was structural. A staffer stepped forward with a velvet cloth in hand. Beneath it, a plaque, just installed, the first of its kind. In honor of Taria A. Monroe. For using the Constitution not as a shield, but as a mirror. She reached out, brushed her fingers across the engraving, then stepped back. Not to bask, but to clear space. Because this wasn't just her victory. It was everyone's opening salvo. As the crowd began to disperse, reporters rushed in with mics. Someone asked, "What's next for you?" She paused. "Teaching. And dismantling." Another asked, "Do you think this changes anything long-term?" She smiled barely.
It already did. The question is whether the country will catch up to the truth.
Later that night, as the plaza cleared and the monument stood bathed in soft golden light, Taria stood alone, looking up at the stone steps. Dana joined her, holding her coat. "You didn't just change the law," her mother said quietly. "You changed the air." Taria didn't respond immediately. She watched as a group of kids, maybe 10 or 11 years old, approached the plaque, fingers pointed, reading her name aloud. "They'll grow up thinking it's normal," she whispered. "A girl like me, changing the Constitution." Dana placed her arm around her. "Good, let them." And just when the night seemed to fold into itself, a quiet voice behind them broke the hush. "Miss Monroe?" They turned. It was a woman, tall, mid-40s, with the posture of someone used to command, but the eyes of someone looking for clarity. "I work with the Office of the Special Inspector General," she said, "and I believe Judge Bennett may have perjured himself during a closed ethics deposition regarding your case." Dana's face froze. Taria's breath stilled. The woman continued, "Would you be willing to testify again, under oath, not as a student, but as a legal witness?" Taria didn't blink. "When?" The woman smiled faintly. "Tomorrow morning. And America would never be the same again." "Absolutely. Here's a naturally worded, professional-style call to action that fits the tone of the story and motivates your audience. If this story moved you, if it made you think, reflect, or feel seen, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that challenge the system and honor the voices history tried to silence. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear